In ancient times, in the hot city of Nicaea, where the sun melted the roof tiles and dusty streets wound between adobe walls, lived a boy named Muck. Little Muck, as everyone who was not too lazy called him, and this nickname stuck to him firmly, because in height he barely reached an adult's waist. His little body was frail, his arms and legs thin as reeds, and his head disproportionately large for such a tiny creature. He lived in his father's house quietly, almost imperceptibly, trying not to catch the eye. Nature had skimped on his height, but, as if apologizing, endowed him with patience, something so necessary for those whom the world is used to looking down upon. Muck did not argue with the world. He simply lived in his own silence, where other people's gazes could not reach. But quiet days do not last forever. One day, Muck's father took to his bed and never got up again. His death took from the boy not just the only person close to him, it destroyed that fragile wall that for many years had sheltered him from the cold, calculating wind of human greed. The father's bed had not yet cooled when relatives flocked to the house, exactly like vultures scenting prey. Their greedy hands reached for everything that had even the slightest value, to dishes, to fabrics, to copper coins hidden for a rainy day. They looked at Muck with icy eyes as an annoying hindrance and the stake of nature, unworthy even of a piece from the meager inheritance. They divided the father's goods noisily and furiously, and when there was nothing left to divide, they left, leaving the rightful heir only empty walls and a silence in which their cruel words still rang. Of all the father's goods, the relatives left Muck only what did not flatter their greed: old clothes. His father was a man of normal height, and his dress lay on his son's tiny body like a mockery. Muck pulled on the huge baggy trousers that gathered at his ankles in an absurd accordion, and climbed into a wide robe, in the folds of which he drowned, as if in someone else's too large destiny, clearly not cut to his measure. With a long sash, he tied all this multi-layered splendor and tucked his father's Damascus dagger behind his belt, a heavy one, half his own height, dragging in the dust. From the outside it looked ridiculous, but inside this pile of rags beat the heart of a boy who had become even smaller, not in height, but in hope. The relatives pushed him over the threshold as indifferently as one throws out unnecessary rags. The door of his native house slammed behind his back, and Muck was left alone, a small figure in the middle of a dusty, sun-drenched street. He was not angry. He was not even offended. He just stood and did not understand how the world in which he lived so quietly could suddenly turn out to be so loud and cruel. But then he remembered his father's words. He had once spoken to him about happiness, spoken as if it were something tangible, waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. And little Muck believed. With the heavy dagger on his belt and naive faith in his heart, he stepped toward the road, sincerely believing that happiness could simply be found if one walked long enough. The road proved to be a cruel teacher. Day after day, Muck trudged along sun-scorched paths, and his huge outfit seemed to absorb all the dust and weariness of the world. His father's shoes rubbed his small feet to bleeding, the hems of the robe tangled in his legs, and the heavy dagger mercilessly beat against his thin thighs. At night he shivered under the open sky, wrapping himself in his vast robe like a dilapidated tent. Hunger gnawed at him from the inside. Muck picked sour berries by the roadsides and drank muddy water from roadside puddles. The naive faith in happiness waiting somewhere ahead melted with every step, giving way to simple animal fear. And when his strength had almost left him, the walls of a large, noisy city appeared ahead, and in Muck's exhausted heart, hope timidly stirred. Muck trudged through the city streets, peering into the faces of passers-by, but they only turned away from his ridiculous figure. No one offered even a piece of bread or a sip of water. And then, on a quiet street, he stopped, struck by a strange sight. From the windows of a large, richly decorated but rather neglected house, dozens of cats were looking out. Red, black, striped, spotted. Their little faces seemed to Muck more well-fed and content than the faces of the richest townspeople. Suddenly the doors swung open, and a wrinkled, thin old woman appeared on the threshold. "Go eat, my dears, go eat!" she screamed piercingly, waving a wooden spoon. From all sides, from alleys, from roofs, from under carts, cats poured toward her, meowing over each other. A thick, teasing smell of stew drifted down the street, and Muck's empty stomach clenched with agonizing envy of these fluffy, whiskered tyrants. Hunger proved stronger than pride. Muck approached the old woman, bowed low, and said quietly, "Kind lady, take me into your service. I am ready for any work for a piece of bread." Ahavzi squinted, examining the tiny man in his ridiculous attire, and laughed with a rattling, creaky laugh. "I just need a servant," she said, "to comb the fur of my darlings and serve them food on silver platters. You will live in warmth, eat your fill, and at the end of the year, you will receive a generous salary." Muck's eyes flared. Warm shelter, hearty food, and a salary. Was this not the very happiness his father had spoken of? He nodded joyfully and stepped over the threshold of the strange house, unaware that he had traded the dusty road for service to the most capricious and willful masters in the world. Muck's joy evaporated on the very first day. Life in the house of Madame Ahavzi turned out not to be service, but real slavery, and slavery to those whose main talent was the ability to meow loudly. Every morning he washed, combed, and laid a dozen spoiled cats on silk pillows, and each of them felt its power. They scratched his thin hands, hissed in his face, and disdainfully turned away from the food if the dish was served with insufficient respect. The old woman, at the slightest meowing of her darlings, brought down her anger and reproaches on Muck, forcing him to serve even more diligently. Muck quickly realized the bitter truth. In this upside-down world, cats were the masters, and he was their pathetic, disenfranchised servant, standing lower than any tailed tyrant. But the true nightmare began when Madame Ahavzi left the house. As soon as her footsteps faded behind the door, the fluffy angels turned into frantic demons. They rushed through the rooms in a mad whirlwind, knocked expensive vases off the tables, tore Persian carpets with their claws, and knocked over jugs of milk. Muck dashed after them on his short legs, begging them to stop, but the cats only hissed in his face with outright contempt. However, as soon as the familiar shuffling steps of the mistress sounded on the street, an instant later, complete idyll reigned in the house. The furry beasts sat decorously on silk pillows, purred peacefully, and washed themselves with their paws, radiating such holy meekness that Muck himself doubted for a moment. Had he imagined this whole mess? Returning and seeing the broken vases and torn carpets, Madame Ahavzi turned purple with rage. The cats immediately rushed to her feet, caressing and purring with such an innocent look that the old woman did not doubt for a moment. The clumsy dwarf was to blame for everything. She did not listen to excuses. Grabbing a stick, she brought blows down on Muck's thin back, and then announced that she was depriving him of his salary for all the months of service, down to the last coin. In the evening, Muck sat in his cramped closet, beaten and hungry. His back burned from the blows, but his soul ached even more, from the realization that in this house truth always purred, and lies always won. The tears dried on his cheeks, and despair was replaced by a cold, firm resolve. He must escape from this hell, whatever it cost him. Having decided to run away, Muck reasoned, it would be foolish to leave empty-handed. The old woman owed him for months of hard service, and he had the right to take at least something. Then he remembered the room on the top floor, the door to which Madame Ahavzi always locked with a heavy padlock. No one ever went in there, and this alone awakened a burning curiosity in him. One morning, when the old woman hurried to the market, in her haste, she left the key sticking out in the keyhole. Muck froze, looking at it. This forgotten key became for him an invitation to break the only prohibition in a house where all the other rules were already against him. His heart pounded right at his throat when he turned the key and the heavy oak door gave way with a creak. The room turned out to be cluttered with ancient junk. Dusty carpets, decrepit clothes, tarnished weapons and books covered with cobwebs. No chests of gold. Disappointed, Muck noticed something shiny on the top shelf and reached for it, rising on tiptoe. His short arms were not enough. He stretched out with all his might and hit a huge crystal vase with his elbow. It crashed to the stone floor with a deafening ring, shattering into hundreds of sparkling shards. Muck grew cold. It was Madame Ahavzi's favorite vase. If the old woman saw it, she would kill him. The ringing of broken crystals sounded to him like an alarm bell, announcing he must run now. In a panic, he grabbed the first thing that came to hand, a pair of huge, dust-covered old shoes. and a small wooden cane with an intricately carved lion's head. Pressing these strange trophies to his chest, he dashed headlong out of the house without looking back. Muck rushed through the crooked streets without picking a path. The hems of his robe lashed his legs. The cane beat against his thigh. His heart beat so loudly that it seemed the whole city could hear his desperate flight. He looked back at every turn, and around every corner he imagined the furious Ahavsi with a stick, or her vengeful cats flying after him in a red, hissing flock. The red-hot cobblestones of the pavement burned his bare feet, and Muck, on the run, shoved his feet into the huge old shoes from the secret room. They dangled ridiculously on his small feet, but still saved him from the heat. He was not running toward happiness, but away from someone else's anger. And only when the city gates were left far behind did he allow himself to finally stop and catch his breath. And then the incredible happened. As soon as Muck took his first step along the dusty road, the shoes seemed to come alive. They no longer dangled and burdened him. They pulled him forward with an unknown force. The second step carried him a dozen meters, the third, and he was already flying above the road, barely touching the ground. Trees flashed in colored spots. Fields and villages merged into one motley strip. His short legs, which had served as a reason for mockery all his life, suddenly gained wings hidden in the worn leather of the old shoes. Delight mixed with terror. He was rushing faster than the wind, but how to stop? Remembering how he had accidentally spun on his heel running out of the house, Muck abruptly turned on his heel 3 times. The shoes froze in their tracks. He collapsed on the grass, breathing heavily but shining with happiness, for he understood. The old shoes were magical. Having caught his breath, Muck began to examine his second prize, the wooden cane with an intricately carved lion's head on the knob. He thoughtfully struck the ground with it. A strange, clear ringing sound was heard. He struck again, and the cane seemed to tear itself out of his hands, tapping rapidly in one place, as if sensing something in the depths. Muck tried to hold it back, but fatigue took its toll. He fell asleep right on the grass, tightly gripping the cane. In his dream, a little dog from the old woman's house appeared to him. The only creature that had been kind to him. She spoke in a quiet voice. Where the cane strikes 3 times, silver is buried. Where it strikes twice, pure gold lies. Muck woke up at dawn and sat motionless for a long time, realizing the wood, crowned with the head of the king of beasts, was not a cane, but a key to any treasures of the world. Muck sat on the grass, squeezing the cane in one hand and stroking the worn leather of the magic shoes with the other, and felt that something was changing inside him. The fear was leaving, and in its place came a bold, previously unknown hope. He was no longer a pathetic dwarf, driven by all winds. He had a speed that no steed could match, and a cane capable of finding any treasure. Enough serving cats and enduring the beatings of old women. He had heard stories about a powerful king whose capital shone beyond the mountains, and the decision ripened instantly. He would enter the service of the monarch himself, not as a beggar petitioner, but as a man who had something to offer. Muck put on the magic shoes, tightly gripped the cane, and stepped towards the royal throne. The magic shoes rushed him to the capital in a matter of days. Muck confidently approached the palace gates and announced to the guards that he had come to hire himself out for the position of the chief royal messenger. The guards exchanged glances and burst out laughing. The little man in a huge robe, with a dagger dragging along the ground, and in gigantic dusty shoes, looked hilarious. Laughter rolled through the palace like a wave, from the guards to the servants, from the servants to the courtiers, from the courtiers to the throne itself. The news of the funny dwarf reached the king, who loved entertainment more than state affairs. "Let him in," ordered the monarch, anticipating the fun. Muck stepped into the throne room to laughter and hooting. He came to offer them the speed of the wind, and they saw only a funny toy in oversized shoes. The king, barely restraining his laughter, listened to Muck's request and slapped his palm on the armrest of the throne. "All right, little one," he said. "I will give you the position of messenger, if you prove your nimbleness. But you will compete not with just anyone, but with my best runner in the whole kingdom." The courtiers giggled, anticipating the fun. Muck, not in the least embarrassed, bowed with dignity and said quietly, "I agree, Your Majesty." The race was scheduled for the next morning in a huge meadow behind the city wall, so that all the people could enjoy the unprecedented spectacle. The royal runner appeared first, a tall, muscular youth with long, strong legs, who cast a look of contemptuous pity over his tiny rival. Against these dear legs, Muck could put up only calm confidence and a pair of old, worn-down shoes, whose great secret no one here knew. The huge meadow was dotted with spectators. The king sat on a high grandstand, surrounded by courtiers, anticipating a merry amusement. A signal sounded, and the royal runner dashed off like a shot arrow, instantly leaving Muck far behind. The crowd burst out laughing, but Muck was in no hurry. He calmly adjusted his vast robe, gripped the cane tighter, and turned on the heels of the magic shoes. In the next moment, the laughter stopped, as if cut by a knife. The small figure soared above the ground and rushed forward, barely touching the grass. Muck was not running, he was flying, gliding through the air with the lightness of a moth. He overtook the royal champion as if the latter had grown into the ground, and the laughter of the crowd, still ringing in the air, broke against his back when the little man turned into lightning. He crossed the finish line first, not out of breath in the slightest, and gracefully bowed to the speechless king, whose jaw had dropped in amazement. The king kept his word. He solemnly appointed Muck as the chief royal runner and the personal messenger of His Majesty. For the first time in his life, Muck received a real salary, a beautiful uniform, finely sewn to his own measurements, and the respect of ordinary people who followed him with admiring glances on the streets of the capital. It seemed that happiness was found, but in the palace everything was different. The courtiers, who only yesterday had laughed at the funny dwarf, now clenched their teeth in anger. They could not forgive that some freak had bypassed their favorite and taken a high position under the king. Clouds of black, poisonous envy began to gather behind Muck's back. He received a velvet caftan, but along with it, he acquired an invisible trail of someone else's hatred, dragging behind his every quick step through the palace corridors. Position and caftan did not save him from loneliness. Muck noticed everything: the sideways glances in the corridors, the angry whispers behind his back, the contemptuous smiles of noble lords who fell silent when he appeared. He was respected, but only out of fear of his incredible speed and not as a person. This fear was cold and did not warm the little heart, which so craved simple human warmth. And Muck, in his naivety, decided that this warmth could be bought. If I become generous, he thought, if I distribute gold, they will stop despising me for my height and become my friends. For this he needed money, which the meager salary of a messenger could not provide. But after all, he had the cane with a lion's head, smelling gold through the thickness of the earth. Muck waited for a dark, moonless night when the palace plunged into sleep, and secretly slipped out into the old abandoned royal garden. The silence was such that he could hear the beating of his own heart. Sneaking among the ancient trees, he tapped the ground with his cane, listening. Under the old apple tree, silence. By the stone wall, silence. But under the roots of a huge, spreading oak, the cane suddenly came alive in his hands, and twice, loudly and distinctly, struck the ground. Gold. Muck trembled with excitement. He took out a hidden shovel and began to dig, biting into the dense earth. Soon the shovel hit something hard. From under the roots, he extracted a heavy, moss-covered jug, filled to the brim with ancient gold coins, a forgotten treasure of a former king. In the starlight, the coins glimmered dimly, and a simple wooden stick turned out to be a key to the earth's bowels. The next day, Muck began to sow gold, like a sower sowing seeds, hoping to grow a field of friendship. He arranged lavish feasts, inviting the very same lords who only yesterday despised him. He generously handed out ancient coins left and right, gave expensive gifts, looking into the eyes of the courtiers with a timid hope of seeing at least a drop of gratitude in them. But on the poisoned soil of the court, only prickly weeds of greed and suspicion sprouted. The lords took his gold with fake smiles and whispered behind his back even more viciously than before. Where did a pathetic dwarf messenger get so many ancient coins? Is he not stealing from the royal treasury? The chief treasurer, an envious and cunning man, was the first to sense something wrong. He began to follow Muck's every step, taking note of every spent coin and patiently waiting for the moment to strike. The treasurer acted quickly and ruthlessly calculatingly. Having persuaded envious lords, he appeared before the king with a denunciation. Little Muck secretly enters the royal treasury and brazenly steals gold. Where else does this pathetic dwarf get so many ancient coins, which are not even in your own treasury, your majesty? They whispered. And every word fell as a poisonous seed into the fertile soil of royal greed. The king believed instantly. That same night, the guards burst into Muck's chambers. He was seized sleeping, thrown onto the cold stone floor, and brutally beaten. Heavy iron chains closed on his thin wrists, and the shackles seemed even more monstrous on the tiny body. The gold coins, which you generously gave away in search of love, turned into these shackles. He was thrown into the deepest and darkest dungeon of the palace. The imminent death penalty for theft hung over his large head. Muck lost everything. In the morning, Muck, in heavy chains, was dragged into the throne room. The king sat on the throne, surrounded by triumphant lords, and his face was made of stone. "You are accused of stealing from the royal treasury," he said coldly. "The sentence is death." Muck grew cold. He fell to his knees, and the chains rattled on the marble floor. "Your Majesty, have mercy," he cried out in a breaking voice. "I did not steal. I found the gold in your garden with the help of a magic cane, and I run so fast thanks to magic shoes." The words burst out before he had time to realize what he was doing. The fear of death tore from his chest the only secret that made him great, and threw it at the feet of the one who was ready to step over someone else's life for a piece of gold. The throne room froze in greedy silence. The king did not believe a single word, but ordered the things to be brought. The guards delivered the old, huge shoes and the wooden cane with a lion's head. The monarch, with disbelief, pulled the shoes onto his royal feet, and in the next moment forgot about dignity. He rushed around the throne room like a madman, knocking down chairs and shoving servants, and his crown slid to one side from greedy delight. Then, breathing heavily, he grabbed the cane and rushed into the garden. Under the very first tree, the cane struck the ground twice, and the king's eyes flared with an insane fire. Gold. Gold everywhere. He understood that he had taken possession of untold wealth and unprecedented power. In this moment, he was no different from those greedy relatives who once fleeced the little orphan to the skin. Having satiated himself with delight, the king returned to the throne and looked at Muck with disgust, the way one looks at a used rag. There was no trace of gratitude. "You have bought your way out of death, dwarf," he announced coldly. "I grant you life, but for your lies and insolence, I banish you from my kingdom forever. If you ever cross my borders, you will be immediately executed." He carelessly waved his hand, and the guards dragged Muck away. He was dragged through the palace corridors, pushed out into the street, and driven to the city gates to the hooting of the crowd. The king took his speed and his gold, leaving only shame and a dusty road, which, it seemed, now led nowhere. Muck again became what he started as, a beggar, a lonely outcast. Muck trudged away from the capital, not picking a path until the trees closed over his head, swallowing the last ray of sun. He had lost everything: his position, salary, magic shoes, and cane. He was again what he started as, a poor, ugly dwarf, fit only for mockery. But stronger than hunger and fatigue burned another pain. He finally understood the bitter truth. Neither kindness nor generosity work in a world ruled by greed and cruelty. Friendship cannot be bought, and you cannot expect justice from those who are stronger than you. Muck sat down under an old tree, covered his face with his hands, and began to cry, bitterly, inconsolably. He cried not for the lost gold, and not for the magic shoes, but for his naivety, shattered to pieces against the stone hearts of those who called themselves noble. Muck wandered through the forest for a long time without a goal and without a road. Trees surrounded him on all sides, paths wound and disappeared in the thicket, and hunger gnawed at his insides with such force that dark circles swam before his eyes. He looked for at least something edible, a root, a handful of berries, a mushroom, but the forest seemed to hide its gifts from him. And suddenly the trees parted, and Muck came out into a sun-drenched clearing. In the middle of it stood a tree, the branches of which were strewn with large, juicy figs. He had never seen such beautiful fruits. They beckoned him with an amber gleam, and hungry Muck, forgetting about caution, ran up to the tree, picked a few figs, and greedily dug into their flesh. They tasted sweeter than honey, and in this forest, where all hope had died, the generous tree seemed to him a gift from fate itself. But the sweetness turned out to be poisoned. Hardly had Muck swallowed the last fig when a strange heaviness spread through his head. His ears began to itch, and he felt with horror how they were growing, stretching upwards, becoming covered with coarse gray fur. Then his nose twitched. It crept forward, lengthening before his eyes, becoming like an ugly, fleshy trunk. Muck ran in panic to a forest stream, collapsed on his knees, and looked into the water. The reflection was monstrous. Huge donkey ears and a long, hideous nose were added to his already ridiculous dwarf appearance. The water reflected not just a tired person, but a cruel caricature whose grief was as long and ridiculous as these new deformities. "For what do I deserve new punishments?" he cried out, clutching his head. "Was my ugliness not enough for me?" The forest remained indifferently silent in response. Maddened by grief, Muck rushed to run away from the cursed tree. Branches lashed his face, his new ears caught on twigs, and his ridiculous nose made it hard to look under his feet. He ran until he was exhausted, and then, panting, mechanically picked a handful of berries from another tree standing nearby, just to quell the bitterness in his mouth. He swallowed them without thinking, and suddenly froze. The heaviness in his head began to melt, His ears began to itch again, but now they were shrinking, drawing back in. His nose tucked in, shortened, returning to its former appearance. Muck rushed to the stream and with a sinking heart looked into the water. There were no donkey ears. There was no long nose. His own familiar face looked back at him. He sighed with such relief as if he was born again. The forest played cruelly with him, but on a neighboring branch hid the cure. Muck sat on the grass and looked at both trees. One disfigures, the other heals. And in his large head, always distinguished by insight, it was as if lightning flashed. Despair disappeared without a trace. A cunning, almost sinister smile slowly spread across his lips. The smile of a man who had just found his true weapon. A brilliant, bloodless, and very ironic plan of retribution against the greedy king and his vile court was born in his brain at lightning speed. Muck wove 2 baskets from vines and began to carefully gather the fruits, the cursed ones into one, the healing ones into the other. Thus, in the quiet forest, armed only with a basket of figs, the little man conceived a revenge that was to thunder louder than cannons. Muck returned to the capital unrecognizable. He got the clothes of a rich Eastern merchant, hid his face under a magnificent turban, and changed his voice, making it creaky and senile. In the palace square, he spread out a silk cloth and laid out the largest, most beautiful and juicy figs on it. Those very cursed ones from which donkey ears grew. Figs of the Sultan himself, he creaked, praising the goods, fruits from the gardens of paradise. Even the gods did not know such sweetness. The royal cook, passing by, stopped dead in his tracks. He had not encountered such unprecedented fruits in all his long life. Without bargaining, he poured out a handful of gold coins and took the basket away to the palace, dreaming of surprising the king. Muck followed him with his eyes and quietly disappeared into the crowd. He sold not just fruits, but sweet, juicy retribution. In the evening, the cook solemnly served the magic figs for the royal dessert. The king was the first to reach for the dish, followed by the princes, the treasurer, and all the lords who had once laughed at Muck. They greedily pounced on the bizarre delicacy, smacking their lips and praising the unprecedented sweetness. And then it began. The treasurer screamed first, clutching his ears. They were crawling upwards, becoming covered with coarse gray fur. Then the princes wailed, grabbing their noses, which were lengthening right before the eyes of the maddened servants. The king, seeing his huge donkey ears and hideous trunk instead of a regal nose in the mirror, howled with such terror that the glass shook. The palace filled with screams and sobbing. Their ugly souls had finally found a worthy external frame, and the whole court, which boasted of its nobility, turned into a pathetic herd of long-eared donkeys. The king in despair convened all the healers of the kingdom, but they only helplessly threw up their hands. Neither ointments, nor decoctions, nor incantations helped. The donkey ears stuck out, the noses hung down, and panic in the palace grew with every hour. And then a rumor spread through the city. A wise healer had arrived from distant lands, capable of curing any, even the most bizarre illness. It was, of course, Little Muck, in a long scholarly robe and round glasses. Completely unrecognizable, he was urgently brought to the palace. To start with, he gave a saving berry to the youngest prince, the one who had mocked him the least. The boy's ears and nose drew back in before the eyes of the amazed court. The king rushed to the healer, grabbing his hands. "Ask for whatever you want, any treasures, just heal me." Muck bowed his head, hiding a smile. Muck asked to be left alone with the king. The doors closed, and then he threw off the scholarly robe and took off the glasses. The king turned pale, recognizing the exiled dwarf. "The cure for your deformity," Muck said quietly, "is in your own heart. But I am afraid you will not find it." He calmly walked over to the chest, took out his magic shoes and the cane with the lion's head. He put on the shoes, gripped the cane, and turned to the speechless monarch. "Wear your ears with honor, king. They suit you very well." He turned 3 times on his heel and disappeared, leaving the greedy ruler with donkey ears forever. Little Muck settled far away, in a quiet city, where he lived in solitude and prosperity. He no longer sought the approval of others. He left not as an avenger, but as a wise man who had learned the main truth. True happiness can neither be bought nor begged for.